"You need to move your car now," barked the police officer as I stood barefoot on my own porch holding a half-eaten popsicle and still wearing oven mitts. I blinked in confusion, looking across the street where Karen was standing with both hands on her hips, smiling like she just won a reality show. Behind her, her guests, an overt swarm of over-perfumed suburbanites, were loitering with folding chairs and foil trays of food, casting irritated glances toward my driveway. One woman even mouthed rude at me. The officer turned back. "Ma'am says you blocked her party guests from using your driveway. You do realize this is a community event, right?" My jaw nearly hit the pavement. That was the moment I realized my sanity was about to be tested by a woman who believed a paper plate barbecue entitled her to private property rights, and she had brought backup with badges. 3 hours earlier, I'd been watching from my kitchen window as dark clouds gathered, not in the sky, but in the form of Karen's determined stride across our neighborhood. I should have known then that a storm was brewing. The signs were all there. It all started when I stepped outside to trim the hedges and noticed several cars idling near my front yard, their blinkers on, drivers peeking around as if waiting for clearance. I didn't think much of it until I went back inside for my gloves and came out 2 minutes later to find a silver Mercedes halfway into my driveway. I waved them off politely and gestured to the street. The woman driving rolled down her window just enough to snap. Karen said we could. I asked who Karen was. She rolled her eyes, hit reverse, and drove off like I'd insulted her ancestors. Then Karen appeared, like she'd been summoned by drama itself, with her trademark platinum bob, oversized sunglasses, and a clipboard that served no actual purpose other than power posturing. She marched up my driveway like she paid property taxes on it. "Hi there," she cooed, voice dripping with fake sweetness. "Just a heads up that we're having a little get-together, and my guests will need to use this space to park. We're short on curb room." I blinked at her, unsure if she was serious. "This is my driveway." She nodded as if I were slow. "Exactly. You're not using it right now, are you?" I looked back at my truck parked at the side, then to her. "That's not how driveways work." Karen's smile faltered. "It's for the community. We're all part of this neighborhood, and sharing is caring." I told her no, calmly but clearly, and went back inside. 2 minutes later, I saw her dragging one of those bright orange cones from her garage, placing it at the edge of my driveway. It had HOA written in shaky black Sharpie, like it was an official roadblock from a cartoon dictatorship. That's when I knew this was no longer a polite misunderstanding. It was a declaration of war. About an hour later, the chaos began to unfurl like a cheap lawn chair. Music was blasting. People were parking half on lawns, half on sidewalks. I watched through my living room window as Karen gave guests what looked like a hand-drawn map, complete with arrows in my driveway labeled as overflow parking. My phone buzzed. 3 texts from neighbors. One said, "You letting them park in your driveway now." Another read, "She told us you're fine with it." The third just said, "Good luck. I'm staying out of it." I marched outside and moved a heavy planter into the middle of my driveway. Within 10 minutes, Karen was back, full fury, unlocked. "What are you doing? That's dangerous. People need to park." I calmly informed her again that this was my property, that she had no authority over it, and that if anyone tried to park here again, I'd call the city for trespassing. She scoffed like I'd just told her Santa wasn't real. "You're making a scene over a little concrete," she snapped. "You think this is your kingdom or something." I shrugged. "It's my land, so yeah, kind of." Karen huffed, stormed away, and started making loud phone calls in earshot. I caught phrases like uncooperative, disturbing the peace, and my personal favorite, threatening community cohesion. A few of her guests started giving me stink eye as they passed, like I was the villain in a story Karen had already narrated into legend. One woman even pointed at my front door and muttered something about how I was the reason neighborhoods fall apart. I had no idea then that this was just the opening skirmish in what would become the Great Suburban War, a conflict that would draw battle lines across perfectly manicured lawns and turned welcome mats into territorial markers. Then came the climax. The police cruiser rolled up, lights flashing like someone had reported a hostage situation. I was on my porch watering the hanging plants when the officer stepped out and asked to speak to me. Karen, of course, was right behind him, looking like a smug peacock in a floral maxi dress. "He's refusing to allow parking for my guests," she said dramatically, "during a community event. It's harassment at this point. He even blocked the driveway." The officer looked confused. "So it's his driveway?" She hesitated. "Well, technically, but we have a sort of unspoken agreement for community use. I'm the HOA president." She puffed up like a bird in mating season. I cut in calmly, stating there's no functioning HOA, no such agreement, and I had every right to control access to my own property. I even offered to show the property deed if he wanted proof. The cop's face went from confusion to realization to mild annoyance in 30 seconds flat. Karen's tone changed instantly. She started crying. Real tears, the works, about how hard it is to build unity in the neighborhood when people are selfish and divisive. She asked the officer if he could at least warn me about being neighborly. The cop looked at her like she was trying to sell him a timeshare. "Ma'am, this is private property. You can't commandeer someone's driveway because your party is crowded." Karen didn't let it go, though. She kept rambling, talking about how some people don't belong in community-oriented spaces, and that she'd be filing a formal complaint with the city and possibly consulting a lawyer. Meanwhile, the officer advised me to just keep my driveway blocked if I wanted to avoid confrontation, and maybe just record anything weird for documentation. I thanked him. He left, and Karen stood at the end of her driveway for a full 5 minutes, staring at me like she was trying to summon a hex. I lifted my popsicle in a mock toast and went inside. The driveway stayed empty, but the war, oh, it had just begun. The next morning started deceptively quiet. I sipped my coffee in the backyard, half hoping the whole scene from yesterday had been a fever dream. Maybe Karen would come to her senses. Maybe she'd realize calling the police over a driveway was embarrassing, even for her. But the moment I walked to my mailbox and saw the envelope taped to it with cheap Scotch tape, I knew we had officially crossed into the twilight zone. The envelope was marked with a logo that looked like it had been printed from a Word document template. A triangle with HOA in Comic Sans under it, surrounded by what I assume were meant to be olive branches. Inside was a one-page letter accusing me of obstructing community functions, threatening a fine of $75, and requesting my cooperative behavior in future neighborhood planning. At the bottom, in a sloppy signature, was Karen M., HOA president. Now, here's the kicker. Our neighborhood doesn't have an HOA. There was one years ago when the community was first built, but it dissolved after too many members quit and no one wanted to pay dues anymore. It became defunct when I first moved in. Karen apparently decided to keep the title like she'd been handed the crown jewels. But her version of the HOA wasn't just imaginary. It was weaponized. What drives someone to create an elaborate fiction complete with fake titles and authority? I wondered if this was the first time Karen had built her own reality, or if she'd been living in this parallel universe for years while the rest of us were just noticing. Over the next few days, I started to realize just how far she'd taken her little delusion. Flyers began appearing on windshields and mailboxes around the block. They featured a blurry picture of my house taken from across the street, with the words "uncooperative neighbor" plastered in bold caps. Underneath, it read, "Refused to participate in community unity. Denied driveway access during block-wide function. May result in future fines." She had printed her own citations. They looked like parking tickets, complete with fake barcodes and the phrase "Violations Department" in bold. I couldn't decide whether to laugh or scream. A neighbor I had only spoken to twice stopped me while I was taking out the trash. "Hey man, did you really call the cops over a barbecue?" I gave him the short version, emphasizing that Karen had called the police on me. He scratched his head, confused. "She told us you threatened to tow her guests' cars and cursed at an old woman." That's when it hit me. Karen wasn't just playing the role of queen. She was writing the script, producing the scenes, and directing the entire neighborhood narrative. She was out here gaslighting the entire street. Another neighbor texted me later, saying she heard from Karen that I had voluntarily agreed to allow my driveway to be used during future events. That was a complete lie. It dawned on me that if Karen could print flyers and forge citations, she could easily forge a community agreement with a fake signature from me. I decided to get ahead of her. I emailed every neighbor I could, explaining what had actually happened, and attached the footage from my security camera showing Karen placing cones on my property and giving instructions to her guests to park there. Most neighbors thanked me for clarifying. A few still believed her. There were people who actually told me, well, she's just trying to build community spirit, like printing defamation flyers is a form of friendship. I started documenting everything, every flyer, every notice, every interaction. My lawyer buddy Travis, who lives 2 blocks over, took a look and burst out laughing. This is either the world's saddest coup attempt or a really elaborate cry for help, he said. He offered to write up a cease and desist, but I told him to hold off. I was too curious. I wanted to see just how deep this rabbit hole of entitlement went. Karen upped the game by hosting another event, this time labeled HOA Unity Night, and she handed out invites like golden tickets. She even taped one to my door, which I didn't ask for. The invite stated, dress code, classy casual, no hostility allowed, driveway use pending. I didn't go, but I did watch as her guests arrived. And surprise, surprise, a few of them again tried to pull into my driveway. I stood at the edge of my yard, arms crossed, expression deadpan. One guy rolled down his window and said, "Is this not open?" I shook my head. "Not unless you're paying rent." He laughed awkwardly, reversed, and parked on the street. About halfway through the event, I noticed Karen holding court at the end of her driveway, sipping a glass of wine and gesturing wildly in my direction while speaking to a group of people. A few turned to glance at me. Some shook their heads. One even gave me a thumbs down. I was becoming the villain in her fairy tale, and the worst part, she was loving it. Later that night, I got another letter. This one was twice as dramatic as the last. It accused me of actively working against neighborhood morale and warned of possible escalation to city authorities for resolution. Karen apparently believed she was the diplomatic channel between me and the entire city. I knew I had to hit back, but not emotionally. I needed precision. The next morning, I went to the city records office. Took me an hour, but I printed out the original HOA termination notice from 6 years ago, the neighborhood plat map showing individual lot ownership, and the legal documentation that confirmed the community association had been dissolved and never reinstated. I made 10 copies, stapled them together, and put a pack in my mailbox labeled Real Facts. Then I left one on Karen's porch. The rest I dropped off with a few neighbors still giving me the cold shoulder. Karen's reaction came quick. That evening, she marched over to my house, didn't even ring the bell, and just yelled from the sidewalk. "That was incredibly disrespectful," she shrieked. "You're undermining years of neighborhood structure." I stepped outside, handed her a copy of the documentation, and said, "There is no structure. It's imaginary. You made it up." She stared at the papers, eyes wide, mouth twitching. "You'll regret this," she hissed, then turned and stormed off. I thought maybe that would be the end of it. Maybe she'd see the documents, realize she'd been exposed, and quietly back off. But Karen wasn't the kind to retreat. She wasn't interested in facts. She wanted control, and facts were just speed bumps on the road to her fantasy world. She disappeared for a few days after that, which I assumed was her licking her wounds. But what I didn't know was that she was planning something bigger, something louder, something with enough entitlement to shatter logic completely. Because Karen wasn't done with me. Not even close. I should have known better than to underestimate the desperation of someone whose entire identity was wrapped up in a fantasy of control. When people can't separate their self-worth from their perceived authority, they don't just walk away, they double down. 3 days of eerie silence followed, and I began to think, maybe, just maybe, Karen had finally given up. No flyers, No sudden backyard parties, no ridiculous cones in my driveway. Even her trademark morning stroll, complete with a clipboard and a coffee cup that probably never held actual coffee, was missing. I let my guard down. I stopped checking my security footage every night. I even allowed myself the luxury of believing that maybe, just this once, logic had triumphed over delusion. But I should have known better. When Karen goes quiet, it's not surrender. It's strategy. She was just waiting for her next move to be perfectly petty and catastrophically public. It was a Saturday. The sun was out, and I was pressure washing my deck when I heard it. Music. Loud, obnoxious pop country music, the kind that always feels like it's yelling directly at your soul. I paused, turned toward the street, and there it was. Karen's yard had transformed into what looked like the grand finale of a dollar store parade. Streamers, balloons, rented plastic tables, and a massive vinyl banner that read, "Highway Summer Celebration. All are welcome." She had even brought in a snow cone machine and one of those sad, deflating bounce houses that squeal like dying whales when kids jump on them. And parked along the street were cars, dozens of them, some on the sidewalk, some half in driveways, and two already trying to pull into mine. I walked out front just in time to see a teenager in a necktie guiding guests toward available parking, waving his arms like he was coordinating air traffic. One guest, a woman in a pastel blouse and pearls, pointed to my driveway. The teenager nodded. She began pulling in. I jogged over, stepped in front of the car, and held out a hand. She rolled down her window. Oh, I was told this was part of the HOA's event space. I looked her dead in the eye. It's my house, my driveway, no HOA. You can park along the curb, ma'am. She blinked, clearly unsure who to believe. I pointed to my front door and said, "This is literally my house. Unless Karen owns time and space, she does not control this concrete." I stood guard like a bouncer for 20 minutes. Eventually, the wave of guests parked elsewhere, though I caught several whispering and glancing back like I was the bad guy in some poorly written suburban drama. Then came the main event. Karen emerged from her backyard in full party regalia, sun hat, glittery sash that read "President," and a megaphone. She strutted to the center of the street and began welcoming everyone to our wonderful neighborhood's official HOA gathering. She kept using phrases like HOA sanctioned and community authorized, tossing around imaginary legal jargon like she was hosting a corporate merger. I stood on my porch, arms crossed. Eventually, she locked eyes with me and gave a small wave dripping with sarcasm. Then she walked over, still holding her megaphone. "You're welcome to join us," she said loudly, loud enough for the guests behind her to hear. "But please don't make a scene this time." I gave a tight smile. "Karen, I'm not going to be part of your delusion." She tilted her head. "It's not a delusion. It's called civic engagement. You should try it sometime." I looked at the crowd behind her. "So you told all these people they could park in my driveway again?" Her eyes narrowed. "You don't have to be so territorial. It's just a few feet of pavement. We're all neighbors. And this neighbor called the cops on me last week over a driveway," I said, raising my voice just enough to make sure her guests heard. She stepped closer, lowering the megaphone. "You're making things harder than they need to be. If you keep acting like this, people are going to start seeing you as the problem." I didn't respond. I just turned and walked inside, but I left my security camera aimed squarely at the front of the driveway. I had a sinking feeling that Karen wasn't done, and I wasn't wrong. Just after sunset, while the party was winding down and people were sipping lukewarm lemonade, I saw it on my camera feed. A man in a Hawaiian shirt and cargo shorts was placing orange cones in front of my driveway. He looked confused, like he didn't know why he was doing it, but Karen was standing nearby instructing him. She pointed to the curb and then to the cones. He nodded and walked away. I grabbed my keys and walked out to remove them. Karen was at the buffet table, laughing with two guests when she saw me. Her face dropped. She hustled over, waving her arms. "Don't touch those. That's for safety. Emergency vehicle access." I picked up one cone. Emergency vehicle access to my driveway. She faltered, "We need a clear turnaround zone." I chuckled, "Then host your circus in a parking lot." She snapped, her tone turned sharp, her volume loud enough to draw attention. "I'm tired of your attitude. You've been antagonistic, disruptive, and hostile toward neighborhood unity. If you don't stop, I'm calling the police again." I raised my eyebrows. "Please do. I'd love to have a record of this." And then, right there in front of her guests, she pulled out her phone and dialed 911. "What's your emergency?" I heard it clear as day. Karen didn't even flinch. "Yes? Hello, I'm at 42 Amberwood Lane, and my neighbor is threatening me and disrupting an HOA event. He's being aggressive and blocking public access. I'm scared he might become violent." I was stunned, absolutely floored. This woman had just escalated a petty power trip into a fake emergency call. She had gone from lying to neighbors to lying to the police again, and this time she was adding violent neighbor to the script. I didn't say a word. I went inside, printed the security footage timestamps, and sat down with a notepad. 15 minutes later, red and blue lights appeared at the end of the street. 2 officers stepped out, one of them the same from the last time. His expression when he saw me was pure exhaustion. I waved from the porch and said, "Good to see you again." He sighed. Karen rushed toward them like she was about to receive a humanitarian award. "That's him." She pointed, breathless and dramatic. "He's been antagonizing everyone all day. He removed safety cones and threatened me in front of my guests." The officers asked to speak with me privately. I calmly handed them the printed timeline, footage, screenshots, and explained everything again. One of them asked, "She's not actually part of an HOA, right?" I nodded. "Correct. We've confirmed that." They talked to her for 10 minutes. Her guests watched awkwardly. She cried again. This time, the officers didn't just give her a warning. They told her if she made another false report, she'd be facing charges. The officers left. Karen didn't look at me this time. She just stood there, frozen, while her so-called party fizzled out like a sparkler in the rain. But I knew she wasn't done yet. Not Karen. Because when people like her lose control, they either disappear or explode. And knowing Karen, I had a feeling the explosion was coming. I've often wondered what makes someone like Karen tick. Is it a desperate need for relevance? A childhood where control was the only currency? Or is it simpler? Just the intoxicating rush that comes from imposing your will on others. Whatever her reasons, I was about to witness the final, spectacular implosion of Karen's miniature dictatorship. I woke up the next morning to the sound of a banging noise outside my front door, followed by what sounded like a dog barking and someone yelling instructions through a megaphone. At first, I thought maybe I was dreaming again, but the sound didn't stop. And when I finally pulled myself out of bed and opened the curtains, I saw it. Karen had gone full dictator. Her garage door was wide open, revealing rows of folding chairs, a whiteboard on an easel, and a massive plastic banner that read, "Emergency HOA Assembly, Neighborhood Crisis Response." The barking? That was Karen's dog, Muffin, now wearing what looked like a vest with security embroidered in crooked white letters. The megaphone. That was Karen's newest weapon, and she was using it to summon the neighbors like some kind of suburban warlord. All residents must attend. "Your voices matter," she shrieked. "This community is under threat." I didn't even have time to process before my phone buzzed with 3 different messages. One from a neighbor that said, "Are we required to go to this?" Another that just read, Karen's at it again." The third was from Travis, my lawyer friend, and it simply said, "You might want to stop by. This is going to be fun." Against my better judgment, I grabbed a lawn chair, walked across the street, and set up on the edge of her driveway. I wasn't going to let her control the narrative again. If she wanted an audience, she was going to get one, with receipts. There were maybe 20 people seated in her garage, most of them looking more curious than concerned. Karen stood at the front like a motivational speaker who had completely lost her grip on reality. The whiteboard was covered in bullet points written in bright red marker: community hostility, unauthorized obstructions, driveway greed, and my favorite, threat level, high. When I walked up, she smiled tightly and gestured to an empty chair in the front. I ignored it and sat in the back instead. She cleared her throat and began. I called this meeting because one resident, her eyes cut to me, has created a hostile environment for the rest of us. He has refused community cooperation, disrupted events, and even endangered guests. There were a few murmurs. One woman in a sun hat raised her hand. Wasn't he just standing in his own driveway? Karen waved her off. That's not the point. The point is that we are a collective, a neighborhood family, and when one member refuses to cooperate, the whole system suffers. I raised my hand. Karen's eyes twitched. Yes, the antagonist in question. I stood up. I've brought copies of the city's declaration that our HOA was dissolved 5 years ago, along with property line documentation, police incident reports, and security footage of your guests trying to park illegally in my driveway. If anyone wants a copy, I've got plenty. I held up a folder. There were some Snickers. A guy in a baseball cap raised his hand and asked, "Wait, we don't have an HOA." Karen visibly paled but quickly recovered. "We have an informal agreement, a social contract." Another neighbor piped up, "You told me I owed $35 last year for community maintenance." Karen's voice cracked. That was voluntary. The room shifted. What had started as a performance quickly turned into a trial. One woman stood up and said she'd been fined for leaving her trash bins out too long by Karen. Another said Karen told her she had to repaint her fence to meet HOA standards. A man from 2 doors down said Karen had threatened to document his behavior because he threw a birthday party without asking her. Suddenly, I wasn't the focus anymore. Karen was, and she was cracking. Her voice rose in pitch as she tried to regain control. "You're all missing the point. He's divisive. He's ruining everything we've built." A neighbor in the back muttered, "We didn't build anything. You just keep making up rules." Karen snapped, "If you all want to live in chaos, fine, but don't come crying to me when someone parks in your yard or your mailbox gets knocked over." She looked at me like she expected a final blow. I gave her one. "I think the meeting's over, Karen." With that, I stood up, handed out the remaining documents, and walked home. Behind me, I could hear the clatter of folding chairs and more than a few angry voices. Karen's carefully constructed fantasy was collapsing under its own ridiculous weight. But the real finale didn't happen until later that week. It was a Thursday evening when I saw the trucks, 2 city vehicles, orange cones, and 3 workers in reflective vests pulling up in front of Karen's house. I walked outside casually, trying not to look too interested, but the scene was pure satisfaction. One of the workers walked up to Karen's door and handed her a clipboard. She argued. She pointed. She gestured wildly at my house. The workers weren't interested. They began removing signs from her yard, fake HOA signage, including one that said, "Private HOA zone, permit parking only." Another city worker took photos of the flyers still taped to a utility pole. A citation was issued right there on the spot. Karen screamed at them that it was all a misunderstanding, that she had authority, that she was preserving community order. But the city didn't care about her imaginary titles. They cared about forged documents, illegal signage, and impersonating a governing body. That night, I got a quiet knock at my door. I opened it to find one of the neighbors who had attended the meeting. She handed me a 6-pack of beer and said, "Thanks for standing up to her." We all knew something was off, but nobody wanted to deal with it. I thanked her, took the beer, and sat on my porch. Across the street, Karen's house was dark, curtains drawn, for once, silence. The strange thing was, I didn't feel triumphant. I just felt tired. All of it. Her fake HOA, her flyers, her cones, her fake police calls. It wasn't about a driveway. It was about power, control, the illusion that she could run a neighborhood like a kingdom and everyone else was just a subject to be ordered around. But kingdoms don't last when nobody believes in the crown. I figured she'd take the hint now that the city, the neighbors, and reality itself had finally sent the message. But I underestimated Karen again. Because some people don't retreat when they lose. Some people just reload. And as I'd soon find out, Karen had one last stunt to pull. One more desperate, entitled, jaw-droppingly stupid move that would finally bring everything crashing down around her. And this time, it wouldn't just be her reputation that got wrecked. I faced down office politics, survived a divorce, and once outran a bear while camping. But nothing prepared me for the sheer relentlessness of a suburban tyrant who convinced herself she was righteous. I was about to witness the nuclear option of neighborhood drama. It was almost peaceful. A few days had passed since the city workers stripped Karen of her fake HOA empire, and for the first time in weeks, the neighborhood felt calm. People waved when they passed my yard. One of the older couples down the block even invited me to a small backyard cookout. Karen's house, meanwhile, had gone silent. The obnoxious banners, cones, and flyers had vanished, and her blinds remained shut, like she was hiding from the sun itself. I almost believed it was over, but this is Karen we're talking about. Silence isn't surrender. It's the sound of someone planning their final act. And this one, it was her most outrageous move yet. Saturday rolled around, and with it came the first hint that something was off. I noticed a row of folding chairs lining the sidewalk along Karen's lawn. Not just a few, dozens. On each chair was a laminated paper with names on them, including titles like Neighborhood Officer and Parking Enforcement Liaison. It looked like she was planning to resurrect her little HOA fantasy again, but this time with more props. I was about to laugh it off when I saw the sign taped to the light pole. Annual HOA Gala, Formal Attire. Responley, Street Reserved. And just under that, a note that made my blood pressure spike. Overflow parking available in neighboring driveways. Please do not disturb homeowners. I walked up to the sign, tore it down, and shook my head. It had her handwriting all over it. I didn't even bother knocking on her door. I figured she'd get the message. But of course she didn't. That afternoon, the guests began arriving. A valet service. She must have hired a couple of college kids with clipboards and walkie-talkies, set up a little booth at the end of the block. One of them approached me as I was tending to my front yard and asked if I could verify which cars are authorized to use your driveway for temporary parking. I looked him dead in the eye and said, "None, not one." He seemed confused and radioed his partner. I heard Karen in the distance frantically trying to smooth things over. Then it happened. The final straw. One of the valets, apparently unsure where to go, parked a large SUV halfway across my lawn and partially blocking my driveway. I walked out, took pictures, and called the city. Not emergency services this time, just the appropriate department for illegal parking and private property violations. I figured they'd issue a ticket or two, tow the car, and be done with it. What I didn't expect was what came next. When the city enforcement officer showed up, he didn't just issue citations. He took one look at the HOA Gala signage, the laminated titles on the chairs, the printed parking notices, and immediately called in a second unit. Within 30 minutes, there were 2 city vehicles and a tow truck on the scene. Guests were beginning to panic. One man in a tuxedo argued loudly with a city officer about prepaid parking rights, while another tried to move her car off my lawn before it got hooked by the tow truck. I stood on my porch, arms crossed, watching it unfold like the last act of a Shakespearean tragedy, if Shakespeare had ever written about delusional suburban tyrants. Then Karen emerged from her house in full regalia. She wore a glittering sash that read HOA President Emeritus, a fake badge pinned to her chest, and held a binder thicker than a college textbook. She marched up to the officers and began arguing, flipping through documents, waving what she claimed were neighborhood ordinances and previously agreed upon rules. One of the city employees calmly informed her that none of her documentation was official, that her use of the term HOA was fraudulent, and that she was now under investigation for impersonating a municipal authority. She didn't take it well. Karen went from shouting to sobbing to bargaining, sometimes within the same sentence. "I'm just trying to create order," she wailed. I've spent years keeping this neighborhood from falling apart, and this is how I'm treated." The officers didn't flinch. They issued her a formal citation and warned that any further impersonation could result in criminal charges. The tow truck removed 3 cars, including the one parked on my lawn, and the so-called gala ended before dessert was even served. The aftermath was surreal. Most of the guests slipped away quietly, some too embarrassed to even make eye contact. A few neighbors later told me that Karen had sent them personalized invitations with hand-drawn maps that marked my driveway as preferred parking. Others said they were told this event was city-approved, and attendance was required to remain in good standing with the community. Nobody knew what that meant, but they went along because they thought it was real. That's the kind of spell Karen had cast over this neighborhood, one of half-truths and fake authority, backed by nothing more than confidence and a clipboard. The next morning, Karen's house looked defeated. Decorations still hung limp from her porch, but the blinds stayed closed. No flyers, no cones, no barking dog. It was like the entire illusion had finally collapsed in on itself, leaving nothing but quiet and regret. But I wasn't done, not yet. I gathered all the documents I had, photos, security footage, printed signs, city reports, and walked them straight to the city office. I wasn't looking for revenge. I wanted a record, something that proved what had happened in case she ever tried this again. And just for good measure, I posted a summary in our neighborhood group chat. No mockery, no gloating, just the facts. What Karen had done, what the city's response had been, and a reminder that no one here was obligated to follow rules made up by a neighbor with delusions of power. The response was overwhelming. People shared their own stories, times Karen fined them for imaginary violations, berated them for not mowing their lawn on community maintenance day, and threatened to ban them from future events. One guy revealed she had sent him a bill for $30 because his Halloween decorations were out of theme. For the first time, people were talking. The fear spell had broken. A week later, Karen's house went up for sale. The listing described the property as being located in a tight-knit, HOA-managed community, which made me laugh so hard I nearly choked. She moved out 2 weeks after that. No one helped her pack. No one waved goodbye. The day after her moving truck left, a few neighbors came over and suggested we have a real block party. No cones, no fake fines, just food, music, and people not walking on eggshells. I hosted it in my backyard. Everyone was invited. People brought chairs, grills, coolers. Kids played in sprinklers. Someone even set up karaoke. The driveway stayed clear, not because anyone told them to, but because they respected it was mine. And that's the difference. Real community isn't built on power trips or fake positions. It's built on mutual respect, honesty, and knowing when to mind your own business. Karen never understood that.